going to be unable to join us. All right, it says recording in progress. So we're going to get going. It's hard to believe we've made it all the way to the 1960s. Okay. Share screen. Actually, yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, there we go. Share. Okay. So I'm going to put into the chat window my contact information. And if you have any questions, you may put that into the chat window, and anything that should come up after the meeting, you're welcome to contact me and say, hey, and we'll get you all set. Okay, so let's start. Slideshow. Slideshow, there it is, from beginning. Okay, still admitting some folks here. So working on that. There we go. All right, so hello everyone on this snowy Thursday night, at least snowy in Denver. I know some of you might not even be in Denver. We're doing the 1960s tonight. My name is Kevin. If you have any questions, let me know. Should we have any problems with the technology, just give me a buzz, shout out here in the chat window, and we will try to get you set. This will be recorded and will be up on the website afterward. All of the previous ones are there as well. So if you've missed any of the previous ones, you just look up Treasure Box Tours and YouTube, and we have a YouTube page, and all of them are there. This presentation chain will continue until next year, because we're only going to get to the 1970s next month, which will leave another few decades to cover next year. So we'll have more into the new year. Okay, so let's get going. The 1960s. There I am, Kevin. And let's talk about some fun things, or maybe not so fun things, that happened during this time period, Denver and beyond. 1960, Bent's Fort becomes a National Historic Site. This is one dear to my heart. I have participated in the live reenactments there, so I love Bent's Fort. And a National Historic Site, which is a really good thing. If you haven't been to Bent's Fort, they do reenactments out there. They bring the place back to life, I think 4 times a year. So if you haven't done it, you should. So much fun. Okay, and sadly, on the other side of things, we have some fun stuff and we have some sad stuff. Adolf Coors III was killed in a failed kidnapping scheme. Most of you probably know this story. He was a man of great predictability and was going to get stopped on this bridge as he came out of his property and going to be kidnapped. But in the end, he fought back and was shot to death, and his body was found many months later, not far out of Colorado Springs, I believe it was. So a sad story, super duper famous. Some of the cities that incorporated around us, we'll talk about here. 1961, Broomfield incorporates. For those of you who don't know Broomfield history, it's actually a fascinating story. They have multiple museums there, so one for you to look into in the future. Broomfield was a really tiny town. It got started because Adolf Zang of the Zang Brewery needed a place to have his orchard and to breed his Percheron horses, which are the giant ones. Later, the expansion of Broomfield really would explode with the Boulder-Denver Turnpike, eventually spreading into 4 different counties. The citizens of Broomfield voted to become a city and a county back in 1998, and that was implemented in 2001, I believe it was. So today, Broomfield is the smallest county in the state, and weirdly, it's a strangely unusual governmental structure. Colorado has 2 of those, 2 city and county entities. 1950s, we talked about this last month. We start our interstates. Well, we went bananas during the 60s. Interstate 70, 270, 225 all got started in the 60s, and I-25 finished after 11 years. The last section of I-25 was in the Walsenburg area. Speaking of interstates, the first bore into the tunnel to go under the Continental Divide there on I-70 happened in 1968. It would take multiple years to do that. The first one, 1968 to 1973. The second tunnel, 1975 to 1979. If you have not toured those tunnels, you should. It's a really cool tour. Those people are up there, someone I should say is up there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is what they told us, because you never know when something's going to happen and you're going to need someone on site. Also, speaking of tunneling, the digging under Cheyenne Mountain began in 1961 with NORAD opening in 1967. This is one of those sad stories. I always just assumed that one day I'd get to go tour NORAD because I spent a few years in Colorado Springs. So I never did it because I was always going to be able to do it. And now one is not able to do it. So if any of you know how to get into NORAD, please let me know. I would love to take a tour. I've never taken a tour. 1968, Lakewood and Wheat Ridge incorporate. Wheat Ridge has actually been around since 1859, but they, solidified that in the modern day. And Lakewood, actually I put 1968 there. Lakewood is actually 1969. So that's my mistake. I apologize. Lakewood is 1969. And a very important thing from the 1960s in Portsmouth, Virginia, at the Naval Air Station there, a very good-looking future tour guide was born. I don't name names because, you know, it could be any tour guide. I don't know. Well, I don't know. You can think of a name. But back in 1968, whoever that devilishly charming tour guide was, he was born in 1968. All right, we do this each time. So a reminder that I do not make these. My colleague at Denver Urbanism makes these. He is a brilliant fellow, and very glad to be able to share these with you. If you want more information, please go to Denver Urbanism. So we're just going to look. I'm going to go back and forth a couple times so that you may watch. The gray spots are places that had already been developed, and the red spots are things that were developed during that decade. As you see, the 1950s, which we talked about last month, was a really busy busy decade, excuse me, the 1960s and the 1970s. So let's go back a little bit and look. 1950s, Denver expanded outward. We became a place that was abandoning its downtown core, I mean hardcore, and we were building into the new neighborhoods, especially to the southeast and southwest. My mother-in-law's house is here in the College View neighborhood. That house, or this house, has already been here for a long time. But if you look to the left, to the west of the College View neighborhood, you're going to see Marlee and Harvey Park and Bear Valley. My goodness, those places went nuts. But in the 1960s, look, expansion definitely slowed. Notice this is the first time you're going to see development in the upper right-hand side there. That's Montbello. There is no Montbello in the 1950s. In the 1960s, Denver does something fairly shocking and annexes on the other side of Stapleton Airport, which everyone felt would be a problem because you were going to have issues with connectivity with that other section of Denver. And indeed, that was the case for many years. Denver continues its rapacious expansion, especially toward the southeast and southwest. So that is why we're able to do more expansion in those areas. However, in the 1960s, all of that very aggressive annexation would have consequences in the 1970s. We'll talk about the Poundstone Amendment next month. In the 1970s, we continue into the areas we've expanded, especially there with Montbello. But you notice in the urban core, there's not a lot going on. So this is something you should go back and look at later when you have this recording, and you may dive on into this area and explore it more fully. All right, so as I mentioned, the downtown urban core was dying fast. So the reason for this, as we have seen in many parts of the country, a lot of folks wanted to go out, bright, shiny, new suburbs. It was a new trend. All these new houses had air conditioning. They had giant 12-inch TVs. They had picket fences. they had all the latest amenities, and you didn't get that with your old houses in town. My parents, they're no longer with us. My parents were absolutely the epitome of this. Everywhere we moved, and we were in the military, and after we were in the military, my parents kept moving as though they were still in the military. Everywhere we moved, we always moved to the bright and shiny and the new, everywhere we went. So this was a time when the bright and shiny and new was where folks wanted to be. But what that meant is the downtown area was a little unhappy. So if you look on the lower left-hand side here, you're going to see what would become the Auraria Campus. The former city of Auraria, Denver's first annexation back in 1860, later on became a sort of an ethnic neighborhood. It started German, then they added in Jewish folks and Hispanic folks. By the 1960s, Auraria was a mix. I'd say probably if you had one group more than another, it would have been the Hispanic folk in the area that was Auraria, also called sometimes West Colfax, once upon a time. But the city was looking for a way to revitalize its downtown, and so that meant redeveloping that site. So there I am with the Lynx, which is one of their mascots. And what they did is demolished it to build a campus for UC Denver, Metro, now Metro State University, and the Community College of Denver. Now, that's not to say that there were not some things already there. If you look, you see some of the things that are left. There were plenty of things there. If you look at the upper left-hand side, those are some of the houses which they decided to keep, making the 9th Street Historic Park. Along the 9th Street Historic Park, they're going to have signs in front of each building. You see one of the examples of that on the upper right-hand side. They kept St. Cajetan's Church, which you see there in the middle, bottom. On the lower right-hand side, that building started out as an Episcopalian church and then later became a Jewish synagogue. That today, along with St. Cajetan's, both of those have been desanctified and are now event space. The Tivoli Brewery, still standing now, though it is the student union for the 3 institutions. So Metro started 1965 with just under 1,200 students. They'd gotten $2 million from the state to start building the campus, and that's exactly what they did. While they were waiting, all of these institutions would have used downtown buildings for their classes. It wouldn't be until really the 1970s that today's Auraria campus would open up in earnest. But this came with a lot of unhappiness. There were a lot of people sort of kicked out of their homes and businesses closed. So it's something that we don't think about as much today, the Auraria campus. Very vibrant. It's the largest of the University of Colorado campuses by students, number of students. But yeah, it's built on the misery of a lot of folks forced out of their homes. Okay, how were they able to tear down homes is the question. So, okay, it's a really big story, and I've had it explained to me a lot of times. So I'm just going to try to synthesize this down. In the 1960s, the idea of historic preservation really had not blossomed. Dana Crawford is a name you might know, and she would make her fame along with her colleagues in saving Denver's first historic district, which is Larimer Square. But tearing things down was the norm. The Downtown Urban Renewal Authority, aka DURA, basically could do what it wanted. I mean, almost without exception, they could tear things down. We're going to talk about some of the buildings that were torn down, and no one really raised much of a peep. We do have some examples from the past of organizations kind of stepping up and saying no and succeeding, but those are really the exception. So I guess sort of habit, the legal piece, that there wasn't much of a provision for keeping these things, and also anyone who said no was seen as an impediment. I mean, Dana Crawford was branded as the Dragon Lady because she stood in the way of improving the city. And that was meant as a negative. They called her that, and it was not meant as a compliment. As I understand it, she has taken it on as a compliment. But yeah, at the time, it was not nice. So the same goes for those houses on Auraria. Oh, and then, of course, I suppose you could add the racial element there. We have a long and rich history in the United States of tearing down houses for other people, poor or different. Okay, that's a much larger story. I've spoken with Tom Noel about it. I've spoken with Sean Snow about it. I've talked with a lot of people about it. So I've gotten an earful from a whole bunch of folks. So I'm sorry if I missed any point to that, because it is a big story. Okay, as we make our way along, another thing that went up in the 1960s, the Denver Botanic Gardens Conservatory. Now, the Denver Botanic Gardens, former cemetery, was actually begun in the 1950s. So we talked a little bit about that last month, excuse me. But that also meant we needed to continue building because you can't build everything all at once. So over time, they built additional structures, including and I have to make sure I have the name correct because I always just call it the conservatory. Okay, here it is, the Betcher Memorial Tropical Conservatory. Completed in 1966. The Betchers, of course, giant names in our state's history. Charles Betcher is generally considered to be kind of the quintessential Denver businessman of the 1800s. And in fact, if you ever do a German Denver tour, or if you do our Chris Kendall Market tours that we're doing this year, we are going to touch a little bit about him. You know, you got to give money back after you've made so much. So this building, which Betcher paid to have built, totally works because the cement that you see there is something that came from their famous Ideal Cement Company and building in Denver. So as I understand it, the support beams, the lacing in between there, that's all cement, and then you have plexiglass. So the plexiglass is supposed to be able to withstand hailstorms and that sort of thing. So we will hope for good things. Now, when I was a volunteer at the Denver Botanic Garden, I used to go in there a lot because of all of the smells on the earth. They have in there my favorite of all smells, and you see the flower over here on the right-hand side. That is an ylang-ylang tree, which is a native to the tropics. And when I was in Peace Corps there in the Indian Ocean, they grew ylang-ylang, which is a perfume base. So if you ever get a chance to go in there, that might be your chance to smell this wonderful flower, although you're going to want to go in there when it is blooming. So this is the Betcher Memorial Tropical Conservatory with the ylang-ylang tree. Okay. Now, another thing that happened in Denver was the very first Chicano Youth Liberation Conference in the United States. Happened here in 1969. Now, the fellow in the upper right-hand side there, that is Cesar Chavez, excuse me. So he did visit Denver, but he is not from Denver. If you know the story of that gentleman, you'll remember all of the work that he did for civil rights in the 1960s and into the 1970s at the national level, especially those working in the farming industry. Locally, the name that you would want to know is Corky Gonzalez. The library that you see in the lower center picture here, that is named in his honor. The Si Se Puede in the upper left-hand side there, that is in Cesar Chavez Park up there on Tennyson. Oh, what is that, 40th or 41st, right in that part of the world. That's where the old Alcott School used to stand. In the 1960s, of course, civil rights, it's a big deal. We're trying to get things even for all folks. Well, the civil rights movement initially sort of focused on the country's Black citizens. Well, Corky Gonzalez, Cesar Chavez, and others realized that what we needed was civil rights for all people, including the country's Chicano folks. And so these people pushed for it at the national level, and Corky Gonzalez spearheaded this conference, which was the first of its kind in the nation, along with the Spiritual Plan of Aztlan, a manifesto demanding self-determination for Chicanos. For those of you who know the Santa Fe Theater there at, 10th and Santa Fe, they renamed that theater the Aztlan in the 1970s. That's kind of been forgotten now, but if you look, you'll still see it on the front of the building. So Corky Gonzalez said, And I got to get my quote here. The conference brought together for the first time activists from all over the country who were involved in both campus and community politics. The conference was also significant because it brought together young people of all types, students, non-students, militant youth from street gangs, ex-convicts, everyone to discuss community issues and politics. The majority in attendance were from California, all of them, or almost all of them, student activists. So it's kind of funny. The first one in the United States, even though the bulk of the movement was happening in Chicago, or excuse me, not Chicago, California, that first conference actually did happen here in Denver, which I think is kind of fun. If you ever get a chance, there are some amazing 1970s era art displays around the city. If you'd like to look into that, shoot me an email and I'll send you some recommendations. Now, this did not happen in Denver, but it had a direct impact on Denver, so I thought I'd put it in here. Okay, so I hope you've all seen this musical or this movie. It opened in New York City, The Unsinkable Molly Brown. It is a fictionalized account of the life of Margaret Brown, who became super duper famous after she survived the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. So 1960, on our left-hand side, that's a shot of the radio cover. The record cover. In 1964, with Debbie Reynolds, it was made into a movie. So you see the poster for that movie there on the right-hand side. So this is not accurate, right down to the fact that her name was not Molly, but it's a very exuberant, very upbeat musical. And what it did is, for us at least, here in the metro area, it did two things. First of all, it permanently cemented her name as the wrong name. The fellow who works at the visitors desk there in Union Station says, the question I get most from people visiting from out of the country is, where is the Molly Brown House Museum? And when I took my tour of the Molly Brown House Museum, the first thing they told me after the whole no pictures or flash photography or whatever it was, is that her name is not Molly, it's Margaret. And the other thing it did is it cemented Denver as a tourist destination. The folks at Visit Denver have told me that the most visited thing in Denver is regularly the Molly Brown House Museum. In the past, it has sometimes been the Cherry Creek Mall, but generally the Molly Brown House Museum is the #1 thing that people come to visit in Denver. And I have been asked by people from around the world. I had this group of German tourists want to know where it was, so I had to give them directions. So even though this did not happen in Denver, it has had a profound effect on Denver. If you haven't watched or listened, you should do so. You can hum some tunes and learn about the beautiful people of Denver, which is one of the songs there in the movie musical. All right, we just did a post office tour a couple weeks ago. So this guy has been in my mind lately. This is the very famous Byron White. And I think it's kind of fun when you think about someone having such a diverse life. This fellow was a very famous football player, as I understand it. So you see a picture of him there in the upper left-hand side during his football days. He did serve in the war. And after the war, even though he was born in Fort Collins, he did come back to Denver, where he would study and then get into the law. He was nothing gigantic. I guess he worked in some lower courts and such, but what he ended up doing was he spearheaded John Kennedy's campaign in Colorado. Where did he play football? College in Colorado. That I can guarantee you I do not know. So I'm going to have to pass on that. And if you shoot me an email, I'll look it up for you. I am not a fan, so I looked only as far into the sports piece as football. So that's as far as I got. But if you shoot me an email, we'll try to get you the answer. Anyway, he worked for the Kennedy the Kennedy campaign, in Colorado. and he made himself a friend in the presidential candidate. And so in the, oh, someone's saying that he was there with the University of Colorado. Oh, great. Thank you, John. I think it's probably, oh yeah, it's John Blair. Thank you for doing that. I bet you have access to the mighty Google or an excellent memory. So because he was friends with President Kennedy, when an opening came up on the Supreme Court, President Kennedy nominated him, saying, quote, "He has excelled in everything, and I know that he will excel on the highest court in the land." So he was sent to the Supreme Court of the United States, and there he served for multiple decades. He became very well known, and the building that you see in the upper right-hand side there, that was one of Denver's post offices once upon a time. That building was later replaced, and today it is primarily a courthouse. It is no longer a post office. It is just a courthouse, except for a little bit of museum space on the inside. So Byron White, a fine story. Okay, now you knew we were going to be talking about this one, unless, of course, you don't know your Denver history. Maybe you're not from here. I am not from here, but I heard a lot about it. My mother-in-law told me that when the Great Flood of 1965 happened, it really messed with her father's life, because my mother-in-law and her family live on the west side of the river, but her father worked on the east side of the river. And because almost all of the bridges were, sorry, I'm suddenly getting hiccups. Woo! Sorry. Most of the bridges in the metropolitan area were destroyed. If I remember correctly, every bridge between Littleton and Colfax, I believe it was destroyed. I might be misremembering that, but really, most of the bridges were destroyed. Some, of course, were saved, which allowed people to get from one side to the other, but it was a real pain in all the tender parts, because you had to go way out of your way to do it. So 1965, June, it had been a very wet time, as I understand it, and everything was kind of saturated. So they had multiple rainstorms, and the floods, or not the floods, the big torrential drenches moved on, and they covered different parts of the state. We had some flooding down in the Arkansas River Valley and Pueblo, all the way out to Great Bend, Arkansas. And the rains just sort of kept marching north. And so finally, the rains come to the South Platte watershed. They start falling near Sedalia and Plum Creek and Littleton and all that area. And the water just starts going up and up and up. The flood-producing storms following that wet period, some of them dropped up to 14 inches in just a few hours, excuse me. Now, for those of you who don't know, in normal years, the Front Range gets 13 to 15 inches of precipitation a year, and here we're getting 14 inches in just a few hours. On June 16th, the headwaters of the Kiowa and Bijou Creeks just go bananas. In the Littleton area, the flood just did all kinds of damage. Now, the one thing that was unusual from the olden days is a lot of people knew it was coming because the alerts had been given. So we did have a lot of people get out of the way, but that didn't mean there wasn't a lot of damage done. I've read numerous accounts of people actually going to watch the flood pass because they had word that it was coming. So according to the reports I've read, the police and the fire folks had lots of issues with just tourists, or I guess looky-loos, being in the way as the flood continues. I wrote down some quotes here, and I put in a few pictures for you to enjoy. Oh, I wrote down the weather forecast that morning. This is great. So this is the morning of June 16th, 1965. Denver and vicinity, mostly cloudy. Wednesday and Thursday, hold on, have to let someone in. Okay, mostly cloudy, widely scattered showers and thunderstorms, mostly afternoons and evenings. Not much change in temperature. High in the 70s, low in the 50s. That's it. That's about all they said. So here is what one of the folks with the U.S. Geological Survey wrote. This person writing a couple days later in describing it. Hold on, do another slide. Okay, about 2 p.m., a dense mass of clouds descended and concealed the top of the buttes, 7 miles southwest of Castle Rock. The deluge began, not only south of town, but also upon the mountains to the west, near Larkspur, and then progressing farther north. The rain came down harder than any rain any of the local residents had ever seen. More than 14 inches of rain fell near Palmer Lake and near Larkspur in about 4 hours. About 12 inches fell in the Castle Rock area. Eventually, Denver started to get the same rain as well. I wrote down some fun numbers here. Plum Creek in the Littleton area normally has about, let's see, where is it? Oh, there it is. Normally has about 36,000 cubic feet. Hold on. Oh, there it is. Plum Creek normally has a very minor discharge, even in the highest of times, but they had peak discharge in that watershed of almost 40,000 cubic feet per second. One of the other branches of East Plum Creek came up with 126,000 cubic feet. And all of this comes tearing downstream. Now, why is this such a problem? Let's see here. Okay, now, I don't know how many of you have really gone and enjoyed the South Platte River area these days, but once upon a time, the South Platte was really not a pleasant place. My mother-in-law has described it as a spot with a lot of kind of old rickety houses. There was a lot of trash. People threw stuff in because they just didn't care. The South Platte River was not a very attractive place. It was really dirty and lots of pollution. All of that got picked up, all those old cars and dishwashers and trash and dead trees and such, and those became giant battering rams, in addition to everything else that was carried away, to just rip everything in the path apart. And the flood continued all the way out to Kansas. The funny thing is, I read some comments from some of the cities downstream, Sterling and other points northeast, and they'd been having lots of drought issues for years, and so the floodwaters coming their way actually helped to recharge some of their water stores. So that's kind of fun. So the flood of 1965, after that they said, we need a dam. So that's where we get the Chatfield Dam. So it's southwest Denver. So I could say a lot more about this. There are lots of books, lots of articles. The Littleton Historical Society wrote a really long and beautiful article about the whole thing, but we have to go on. It was a big deal. Oh, I did write down one other thing. Hold on. Okay. $543 million in damage. Okay, the 1965 flood. Oh, hold on. I'm trying to find the numbers. See, I have problems with numbers. Well, this flood ended up doing a lot of damage. It destroyed the race course there. Sorry, I can't find my numbers, too many numbers. But the next big flood we would have in Colorado, the 1976 Big Thompson flood, this one was greater than that in many auspices. Okay, moving on. We have something that happened in the 1960s. We wanted to have the Olympics. So we start agitating for that. Well, how does this happen? There's a really great history about this whole thing written by a gentleman, Doug Wilson. The idea to have the Olympics started as early as the 1940s, and we had a burgeoning ski industry here. Colorado Springs and Aspen and other cities started saying, wow, we really should get the Olympics here. So finally, committees get together and people start talking about it, and we start pushing to have the Olympic Games brought here. We pushed for the Olympic Games in 1960, but it doesn't quite work out. Eventually, we start promoting the idea of Ski Country USA, and our three-time governor, John Love, was pushing for it as well. And so we decided to go for it. Denver officially announced its intention to bid for the 1964, it officially announced its intention at the 1964 Olympics. They said, we're going to go for the 1976 Olympics. In late 1967, the United States Olympic Committee chose Denver as the official bid city for our country because it could be another city. But the US Olympic Committee said, yep, Denver, we're going to make you be the one we're going to toss into the ring. And this eventually was sent off to the Olympic Committee and the International Olympic Committee. And other countries like France and Mexico were vying for Olympics. And eventually they decided that it would come to Denver. Years of planning paid off. And in 1969, they did say that the Olympics would be hosted in Denver. So that's a pretty exciting deal. So here you see some of the paraphernalia from that wonderful fight to get the Olympics in Denver. We'll talk more about what happened after that next time. Another thing that happened, RTD. Now, for those of you who lived in the Metropolitan a really long time, you will remember the DTC, which doesn't stand for the Denver Tech Center. It stands for the Denver Tramway Company, which later became the Denver Tramway Corporation. The Denver Tramway Corporation was built on streetcars. Well, eventually, streetcars would be removed and we'd move to buses. And then later on, they did a reorganization at the very end of the 1960s. And we had an interim company that was later renamed RTD, the Regional Transportation District, in 1969. This is part of the whole Dr. Cog era that we talked about last month. Today, RTD is still going strong, serving almost all of the Dr. Cog area. Dr. Cog, Denver Regional Council of Governments. There are some sections that have very little population that are not served by RTD. So here you have some pictures from that RTD history here in Denver. Yay for public transit. It is a public good, and I'm a fan. Now, earlier I mentioned that old things were generally torn down without so much as a "by you please." They were old. Why would you save it? So the 1960s, we really saw what had begun as kind of a little trickle turn into a torrent. So we lost some really amazing buildings. Here on the left-hand side, you have our downtown post office. Previously, we had post offices that shared function with other businesses in a building. So we had one on the Auraria Campus, and then one on Auraria, and then we had one on Larimer Square, and then one that moved up to 15th and Lawrence. This building that you see here on the left-hand side, this was the first post office that was built to be a post office. On the right-hand side, you have the Tabor Grand Opera House, which is right next to the post office. If you look back to the picture on the left, the building immediately to the left is the Tabor Grand Opera House that you see there on the left. The Tabor story, of course, good night, actually, I shouldn't say of course. I hope you all know that story. If you don't know that story, there are oodles of books out there that will tell you all about it. Horace Tabor gave the money to build this building on the right-hand side when he was rich. Later on, when he was poor, he was made the postmaster for Denver, and he worked in the building on the left, which I think is a little ironic because he worked in the building next to the building that bore his name, even though that was a building he really couldn't afford to go in much anymore. Both of these buildings torn to the ground. 1964, both of these buildings were demolished, and they built at the end of the decade the bank, the central bank that would go there and stands on that site now, 1968. Super sad loss. On the left-hand side here in this picture, another one. Oh, it just breaks my heart every time I look at this. I mean, is that not a beautiful building? That is the Mining and Exchange Building. For those of you who know where the Brooks Towers in downtown Denver is, that's what stands on the site currently. If you look at the picture on the left, look way up at the top and you're going to see a statue there. If you come back to the middle down below, that statue is the one that is on top of the building there on the left-hand side. The statue that you see there of the man, the prospector holding the gold nugget, still stands, except now it stands in front of the Brooks Towers, which is a residential building. The Mining and Exchange Building was torn down in 1963. 2 other pieces of the building were saved. If you look at the upper right-hand picture there, you're going to see the bull and the bear. These were some of the decorations from this building, which was considered to be part of the overall idea of Denver being the Wall Street of the West. Now, while 17th Street was generally considered to be our official Wall Street of the West, the Mining and Exchange building would have taken a part of that. What are the street locations for these? So let's go back one. The post office on the left would have been at 16th and Arapahoe. So the building, if you look at the post office, the building to the lower left, that's 16th Street. The street to the lower right, that is Arapahoe. If you look at the Tabor Grand Opera House on the right, the road down and to the left, that's Curtis. So these buildings would have been on 16th Street between Curtis and Arapahoe. And this building stands at, oh, good gracious, what is that? 15th and, yeah, it's on 15th between Curtis and Arapahoe. Yes. So the bull and the bear up there, those are now in the Kettle Arcade. The bricks that you see in that picture were recycled to that site, and they brought along 2 pieces of the decoration. The bull and the bear, of course, are because of the stock market, the bull market or a bear market. So that's why they are preserved there. So a really sad loss. Now, all of these buildings being demolished, when did the city pass the Denver Landmark Preservation Ordinance? Well, too late for all these buildings. That landmark ordinance in Denver would not get passed until 1967. And by that time, a lot of it was gone. Now, not all buildings, of course. We still have the Kittredge building, the Denver Dry. We still have buildings in the Lodo area, but we really lost so much. It's such a tragedy. Here is a picture looking down onto downtown. I hope you're all able to pick out the Daniels and Fisher clock tower there, that wonderful, lovely little clock tower, and look at all those happy buildings around it. Well, DURA came in, the Downtown Urban Renewal Authority, and they decided, or is it Denver Urban Renewal Authority? You know, suddenly I can't remember. Anyway, they decided, nope, the way to bring people into downtown is to make it bright, shiny, and new, like the suburbs. So they tore a whole bunch of it to the ground, and we ended up with this. Now, one of the things that I think we can all agree on is parking can be fun. Hey, it's nice to have parking. But, I mean, look at that. As Tom Noel says, we ended up with an ocean of one-purpose parking on the graveyards of our history. So if this doesn't break your heart, well, I just don't know what will. So, of course, all of these parking lots are filled in today. We don't really do much in the way of surface parking lots, but when you consider how many historic buildings were lost. So between this and this. Okay, now part of the premise was renewal. You're going to renew this area. And next to the clock tower, they were going to put in Skyline Park. Voters in 1967 did overwhelmingly approve the plan for Skyline Park, quote, to demolish 120 acres of downtown for the promise of gleaming new towers. Okay, hold on here. I have another picture to show you, but I'm going to see what this says in case it's a question I need to answer. I don't remember which year it was, either 69 or 70. I was working at the Western Union at 17th between Curtis and Champa. There was a building, I think it was the 17th and Curtis building, the Republic building. Well, the Republic building's still standing, but we're going to come to that. They decided to knock it down, so they brought in the wrecking balls. They bounced off the building and had to do it with dynamite. Well, it's funny you should say that because you might be talking about this building. I don't know. Is this the building you were talking about? Because this beautiful building was at 17th and Curtis, and this beautiful building was torn down in 1970. This was the Cooper building. I don't know if you happened to have worked in the Cooper building, which they did. And oh, yep, that's it. Wow, that's amazing. I chose the right building. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. So yeah, they had to demolish it with dynamite. This building was so well built that they had to blast it. And this was just one of multiple buildings, beautiful historic buildings in downtown that just got whacked. And this is why. We were going to build a new, it is Denver Urban Renewal Authority. Okay. We were going to build a new downtown. So if you look in this, you're going to see it says Brooks Towers. You're going to see where the Federal Reserve Branch Bank is. You're going to see the DNF Tower with the Skyline Park. But this is multiple blocks of space where they just said, nope, we're going to get rid of it. You did have smaller residential parcels here as well. So you lost about 1,200 people living in this area. They were kind of forced out. But at the time, this was considered to be an acceptable use of the space. I also want to draw your attention to the other side of the creek on the left-hand side of the image. That is what the Auraria Campus was at the time. It was bunches of buildings. All of that would also be demolished as well. So if you look, there is no LODO yet. At the very top of the screen where it says light industrial and commercial, that's LODO, but it's not LODO yet. And then if you look at the bottom part of the screen, you can see they're going to keep that area solid. The federal complex looks in the wrong spot. Let me look here. No, it's in the right spot because you can tell because the DNF Tower is at the corner of 16th and Arapahoe, and the Federal Reserve Branch Bank, which is the gray building, which is number 25, is in the right spot. Okay, so the 60s, you know, even though it gave us really good looking tour guides, it was, for downtown Denver, it was a terrible time. And it wasn't just downtown, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you probably know, I know Charlotte would recognize it, the building on the right-hand side. It looks very different today because it's got lots of trees, but the building there on the right-hand side is what you and I now call, erroneously, the Molly Brown House Museum. Just look at the tiny, tiny trees there, though. But what I want to draw your attention to is the house on the left. The house on the left belonged to a very successful and really generous Italian immigrant named Joshua Monty. This was one of those rags to riches story. He came to the United States, he had nothing. And he worked, and finally, through just smart and hard work, he became a very rich man. The front gate at 20th Montview and Colorado Boulevard to go into the Museum of Nature and Science, that is the Monty Gate. He built it as part of Spears' Give While You Live campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, the building on the left, that beautiful mansion, is the Monty Mansion. He lived right next to the Brown House. The mansion on the left was demolished. It was torn to the ground, 100%. And people said, wow, if the Monty Mansion may be torn to the ground, well, what's to stop them from demolishing the home of Margaret Brown? You know, what is sacrosanct? What could we lose if we don't start fighting for these buildings? So believe it or not, it is generally believed that the thing that kind of lit the fire under people to preserve what is today the Molly Brown House Museum is the destruction of the Monty House, which was immediately to its north. Okay, I realize this is coming off as a whole bunch of sad. I apologize for all the sad. So let's talk about some happy. So the Celebrity Lanes, the Celebrity Fun Center, all that came in here in the 1960s. This was a part of the Disney family of parks, except in this case, I guess it wasn't a park, more as an amusement park within a building. I know most of you probably have already heard this if you have grown up in the metro area. I only went there twice. I am not from Colorado. I only got to go there twice. I loved it. And someone's saying that they had so many fun times there. I absolutely agree. The Walt Disney Corporation said, I hope as we continue to branch out that we never lose sight of one thing. It was all started by a mouse. The reason it was called the Celebrity Lanes is because many Hollywood celebrities went in on its construction. Names like Jack Benny, George Burns and Gracie Allen, Burl Ives, Bing Crosby, Art Linkletter, etc. A lot of folks. They had the swimming pool that you see right there. They called it the Swamp. Had about 500,000 gallons of, quote, constantly filtered water, I can imagine. They had the, the bowling. They had the arcade games later on. I mean, this place was wildly popular. So folks absolutely loved it. So in the 1960s, it is one of the many things that went in to make Colorado Boulevard the place to be. Another thing that happened in the 1960s, we were talking earlier about issues with civil rights in the United States. Believe it or not, one of the things we're going to talk about next month, the Supreme Court case that decided school desegregation in the United States. That court case began because of schools here in Denver. In 1964, Dr. King, you see him here, came to Montview Boulevard Presbyterian Church here in Denver at Montview, and I think it's Dahlia or Dahlia, depending on which way you prefer it be pronounced. And he gave a talk there about civil rights, about segregation in schools, and just about how people should treat each other. I've had a tour of this building several times, and the folks at Montview Boulevard Presbyterian Church are super happy to have been part of history of the civil rights movement at the national level and certainly locally. So if you ever get a chance to take a tour of this church, you really should. They'll tell you all about it. So 1964, Dr. King came and spoke here in Denver. Okay, let's see what we have next. I think we are done. Okay, tomorrow night, ladies and gentlemen, next year's brochure, our treasure map comes out at Setting the Course tomorrow night, Friday, November 18th. Join us for this in-person event for the big unveil of next year's tours. Fun is guaranteed, which is always the case because I'm going to be there. Hold on just a moment. And yes, I am the one who told the story about Dr. King getting locked into a building there at the church. That is something that they told me. It's a really great story. Dr. King did get locked into his room accidentally, and they couldn't figure out how to open the door, so he ended up climbing out of a window. So it's quite a story, and they told us there. So ladies and gentlemen, I got the brochure just yesterday. So this is the brochure. You don't have to attend in person tomorrow. The weather is a little bit icky. So if you would like to attend electronically, a Zoom presentation as we are doing right now, all you have to do is sign up and the link will be sent to you and we'll get you all set one way or the other. Please spread the word because we're hoping to continue doing this in the future. So that was the 1960s. I could have said more, but I had to pick. Right now, if you have any questions, please type them into the window. If you have any questions, obviously you're not obligated to have any questions. Hi, John. Hi, Ann. I see your face there. Hi, Paul. I see your face there. And of course, Ed and Pat here. I see as well. I know there are a lot of people whose pictures I don't see, but I see some of my friends. So if you have any questions, folks, shout out. Otherwise, I'm going to turn you loose. I hope to see you tomorrow night, either in person or by Zoom. And then, of course, we'll do the 1970s next month. And then I'm going to send the links probably sometime in December for when our presentations are going to continue into next year. And I don't know if you'll have to re-sign up for those or not, but we're going to continue with the 1980s starting in January. So ladies and gentlemen, if you don't have any questions, I hope you stay warm. I'll stay on here for a couple minutes in case we have any questions. The 1960s. Good night. Thank you. What is next month's date? You know, I don't remember what next month's date is. If you shoot me an email, I'll tell you. If you signed up for this, you should be signed up for that automatically. Oh, someone says December 1st. Oh, great. Thank you for that. I didn't bring my calendar. Actually, maybe I should be singing in the snow, not singing in the rain. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. Ladies and gentlemen, stay warm. You're beautiful. I'll see you again soon. And good night.